In this video, I'll be going over how to create a hypothesis test, which we will be sharing in our discussion board this week with each other, and we'll eventually put it into our research project. So here we are on our home page. I'm going to click on the weekly modules. And so on the next page, as I scroll down, you can see that I do have our module that has all of the Airbnb research project pieces for quick access right here. And so this week in your discussion board, you're going to create a hypothesis test that will eventually go into your part 3 for the inferential statistics. But before we can do that assignment, I'm breaking up the pieces over the discussion board so you can practice with each other before putting it into that business memo. Let's go ahead and scroll down. So here we are in week 11. We're learning in chapter 9 about hypothesis tests. So make sure to read the chapter and then click on the chapter 9 resources. And in here, you'll have a worksheet that you can download and print out. The PDF slides you can also download and save and print out if you like. And then watch the videos on each of the sections from chapter 9. The worksheet I provide lets you follow along, so you can take notes and practice the problems. There's also an Excel tutorial on how to do the calculations in Chapter 9 in Excel. Again, if you don't have access to Excel, you can virtually connect with a computer here at MiraCosta, just using this link right here. And then once you have Excel, make sure you have the data analysis tool pack turned on, and there are instructions here to do that. So I'm using this video as a chance to remind you of all the resources that are available to you. I'm going to click back. And then here in discussion board 9, this is where we are going to be creating hypothesis tests. So in this week's discussion board, you're going to develop a hypothesis test regarding our Airbnb data and your variables of interest. So it's important that you understand Chapter 9 before you try to create these hypothesis tests. Now, while this is a discussion board meant for brainstorming, you can come up with a couple different hypothesis tests and share that with your peers. That way you can get some feedback, and then just pick one that you want to use for your project. In the post, and I'll show you in a bit, you can incorporate the appropriate math symbols using the Insert Math Equation button. So in Chapter 9, you learned about hypothesis testing. One of the main purposes of statistics is to test a hypothesis, or an idea or theory. A hypothesis is an educated guess about something in the world around you, and it should be testable. So for instance, we might want to run a hypothesis test for a population mean. Remember, mean is the average of something, regarding the price per night. So I have an example right here where for my project, imagine it's in Montreal, Canada, and I want to conduct a hypothesis test for the listings in a neighborhood called Villa Marie. Specifically, I want to know if Villa Marie is greater or less than $120 per night. And so where did I get that $120? It does not come from the Airbnb data itself. It came from the Travel Budget Montreal website, which suggests that it costs about $120 a night for accommodations. Now, your hypothesized value, that's the population mean that goes into our null and alternative hypotheses, can be based on secondary research, meaning you've already done some research out on the internet and you've Googled about some information about your variables. So there's some data out there in the world. It can be a conservative number that you choose, but you'd have to explain why. So for instance, maybe my conservative number is $100 per night. And someone asks, why do you say that? It's like, well, that's my typical budget when I go on travel. Or it's based on some expert opinion, such as a frequent traveler to Montreal who gives you an estimate for the nightly accommodations. Your hypothesized values cannot come directly from your Airbnb data because your Airbnb data is the sample. So we need to come up with a population parameter for our hypothesis test, and then later in a different discussion board, you're going to use the sample data from your Airbnb data set to test against it. So here is my null hypothesis. This is what we assume is true unless we have evidence that suggests otherwise, is that our population mean is $120 per night. The alternative hypothesis states that the population mean is not $120 per night. And so later when you work through to analyze this in a different discussion board, you'll be finding evidence to support one of these hypothesis statements. You'll also want to explain why. For instance, I'm choosing this hypothesis test because I want to market my bike tour of wine bars and breweries in an upscale neighborhood. And I think Villa Marie might fit that description. So I want to know how the price per night in Villa Marie compares to Montreal as a whole. Recall that this 120 is the cost of Montreal in general, according to this travel budget website. Scrolling down, here's another example. Let's say you'd rather test a population of a proportion. Recall that a proportion is where we're looking at some characteristic divided by all the possible listings. So again, we're looking at an example of Montreal, and I'm going to do a hypothesis test for the proportion. It's still focused on Villa Marie, but the characteristic that I'm interested in is apartments. So recall that in our Airbnb data, we have a variable that lets us know the property types. So the apartment is just one property type that I could be interested in for a proportion. Recall that a proportion is only a single characteristic. So you can't say, I'm interested in apartments, houses, and condos. That's 3 different characteristics. That's why I'm very specific here. I'm just interested in the proportion of apartments. Now, in terms of your hypothesized value, with proportions, if we want to be conservative, we always just say 50% or 50-50 chance. 50% chance that it's apartments and 50% chance that it's not apartments, because there's only 2 options. It's either an apartment or it's not. So in my null and alternative hypotheses here, the claim that I'm trying to test is set up in the alternative hypothesis, where the proportion is greater than 0.50. This is what I'm interested in finding out. The reason why greater than is because if more than 50% of listings in Montreal happen to be apartments, that means that neighborhood or that area is more densely packed with apartments and people. And in turn, that means I've got more potential customers in that neighborhood. So that's why I set up a greater than symbol. And so the null hypothesis has to be the opposite, right? So if my alternative is greater than, my null must be less than or equal to. Recall that the equal to always is in the null hypothesis. So it's really important that you understand the concepts behind how a null and alternative hypotheses are set up. Otherwise, you won't be able to set this up correctly, and your analyses won't work out in the upcoming weeks. Now, you'll notice in my first one for means, I put equals, not equals. This is because I really have no idea if it's greater or less than. So simply by putting equals, not equals, when I eventually run my test in a week or 2, wherever my data falls, could be less than or greater than, I'll know either way. It'll let me know which side am I on of the curve. Now, in the second example here, I wanted some direction. I've got some theory. I use that greater than right here. But you don't have to. Again, you could do just like above, do equals, not equals, because I don't know which direction it might be. I don't have any inklings. And to be on the safe side, I'm going to do a 2-tailed test then. And so when I test this eventually, I could be on the left side, which is less than 50%, or on the right side, which is greater than 50%. So you have to decide if you want to do a 2-tailed test or a 1-tailed test and explain why you set it up that way. Once you've posted your original post, make sure to do at least 1 peer post. It's helpful to ask questions about their hypothesis test, offer any feedback, and including any corrections about the hypothesis test. If you see the signs are facing the wrong way, or the number that they're using is not hypothetical from outside research, but rather it came from their sample data, which they're not supposed to do. So help each other out. You're welcome to comment on more than 1 post and try to post to someone who hasn't received a peer response yet. So I'm actually going to go ahead and open up the reply here, and I'm going to pretend that I'm creating my null and alternative hypotheses. So this little button right here, this is the insert math equation. And so this is where you can find the math symbols. If you want to include, let's say here's my mean, that one I'm wanting to test equals that $120 per night. And I'll insert the equation there. And so you can see there's my hypothesis. So I just want to put the H 0 right there. If you want, you can make that 0 a subscript, how it's properly written for null hypothesis. Or if you want, you can even just write out null hypothesis is the population mean equals 120. And then I would do the same thing for the alternative hypothesis. I'll click on my little insert math equation. I'm going to go, let's see, to the Greek letters. There's my mu. Okay, and then under relationships, there's my not equal sign. And I'll do my 120 right there and hit insert. There's my null and alternative hypotheses right there. And then when I hit post reply, it will share out to everybody. Again, make sure you explain your hypotheses. Where'd you get your hypothesized value from? Why do you want to test this particular hypothesis? Just like the examples shown above. So if you have any questions, just let me know.